Hi there, and welcome to this study of end times prophecy in the book of Revelation. We are in the book of Revelation. We have almost come to the conclusion of it. Today we're going to look at chapter 20. In fact, we only have 3 chapters remaining, 20, 21, and 22, so we'll have probably this session and 2 more sessions where we will then have finished out the entire book of Revelation. This entire series we've been going through Daniel, we've gone through parts of Ezekiel, we've gone through Revelation. If you go back and look at our website, journeychurchgillette.com, you can see our study on called Endgame that studied over what Jesus said in Matthew, in the book of Matthew about the end times events, covering Matthew 24, 25, and 26. That was really the catalyst that launched the rest of this series. I would encourage you, if you've not already seen that, to go back and look at that because you'll see the words of Jesus. Now, what we've talked about through this time is that all of these different timelines really begin to match up. We have timelines specifically that look at the nation of Israel. We have timelines that Jesus gave from a disciple's perspective on what we as followers of Christ can look at and see and witness in our lives. And then we have the book of Revelation, which is God's perspective. It is from heaven looking down on what is going to happen from a heavenly perspective. And we can get indications of when we are in those times, but it's God's perspective on how we are to look at the end times events. Well, let's get into chapter 20. Before we do that, let's do a quick recap on what we came through in chapter 19. So in chapter 19, we saw really the conclusion of the events that we know as the events of the tribulation. Now, we have looked at some different timelines, but the timeline that you can really start to identify with is the final 7 years of tribulation. The final 7 years are going to have some different events that take place. You have the 7 seals that take place. Those unroll the scroll that is being held together by the 7 seals. Then you have the 7 trumpets. These are not the wrath of God. The 7 trumpets are the warning signs that the wrath of God is going to come. I have used the example of the events around Jericho when the trumpets blew on the final day. The trumpets blew 7 times. They marched around, the walls fell, and the wrath of God came against the city of Jericho. So it's a good warning, a good indication. Paul says that we will be gathered as a church. We will be gathered to God on he calls it the last trumpet. Now, the last trumpet also corresponds to the 7th trumpet in the book of Revelation. We've seen that together. The 7th trumpet is when the church is gathered. So the last trumpet, the 7th trumpet, this is the rapture of the church. There's no other place that it's covered in the book of Revelation other than this. This matches what Paul said. It matches what Jesus said. Really, it matches the end times events. To read anything else into that is really to read into the text something that is not there. I know that there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of controversy over a pre-tribulation rapture versus a pre-wrath rapture. But if you look at Scripture, the only one that really matches is that pre-wrath rapture. Now, we don't know exactly when that's going to happen in God's timing, but it will happen at the last trumpet, the 7th trumpet, which means we will go through the 7 seal events. We'll go through the trumpet events. We will not go through the wrath events. Those are what are called the bowls of wrath. That is the 7 bowls of wrath that are poured out on the world. This is the judgment that is happening. The church has been removed. We are not destined for wrath. We will not undergo God's wrath. That will then be poured out upon the world in the wrath events, the 7 bowls of wrath that we covered. Now, we've come to the conclusion of this. So let's say that all of these things are happening by the end point here. Somewhere in this final little section is where all of the church is removed, the final battle. So then we see in Revelation 19 that there are 2 things that are happening. There is a heavenly event that is happening, and the heavenly event is called the wedding feast or the marriage supper of the Lamb. The wedding feast of the Lamb is where the church is joined with God forever. The church has been accepted into the marriage ceremony. We have been joined forever with Jesus, who is our bridegroom. The church is the bride of Christ. He is the bridegroom. We have been removed. We are with him. We are celebrating this incredible event, the marriage supper of the Lamb. On earth, there is an earthly thing that is happening, earthly perspective, and that is that there is the final battle. the final battle of the tribulation age. So the final battle of the age, or of the tribulation age, because there's another battle that we're going to see that's going to happen in Revelation 20, but it's a very minor thing compared to the final battle that will happen in the end times event. So heavenly, we're celebrating the wedding feast of the Lamb. On earth, there is the final battle of this age. How far apart do those things take place? We don't really know. It covers it together in chapter 19, and it seems to just go all together as one. Well, that's where we left off. Now, in the events, we had the tribulation events. So we have the final tribulation, and now what launches is that Jesus is in control. And now Jesus is king, and Jesus reigns. Now, how long will he reign? Well, there is what is called the 1,000-year reign, or the millennial reign of Jesus, until the events that we're going to discover in chapter 20. So between essentially Revelation 19 and Revelation 20, we are seeing a 1,000-year period of time that is taking place. Now, last time, I said an interesting way to look at this perspective is that if you look at the timeline from creation to the timeline of the end of the millennial reign, so this is this time right here. So from creation to the end of the millennial reign, of the 1,000-year reign, that time is a period of time of 8,000 years. And this is looking at it from God's perspective in the creation account, because you can look at the creation account and you can actually map out the timeline from creation to the end of that 1,000-year millennial reign. Now, what I had talked about before is there's this principle, and this is very common in Jewish thought as well, that there is this principle that 1,000 years is like one day. Now, if you use that idea, that perspective, and I hope I'm not losing you on this, go back to what God did in creation. In the creation event, the creation account, God created in 6 days. So there were 6 days of creation. Then there was one. I said 8,000 here. I'm sorry, that is completely wrong. That should be 7,000 years, not 8,000 years that we're looking at. So that is wrong. I apologize for that. Okay, so 7,000 years. So so in creation, there were 6 days of creation, and then there was 1 day of rest. And then what happens on the next day? The next day would be the 8th day, and this is where the new begins. The new starts on that time. So God created on 6 days. Man was created, his day of creation. The next day from that was the first day of rest, and then on the 8th day, it all starts over. The cycle starts over. That's why in Jewish culture today you have 6 days, and then you have the Sabbath day, and then the next day after the Sabbath is the first day of the next week. And so what we have here is the first day of the next week. So creation, from creation all the way to the end of the 1,000-year millennial reign, that's the 7,000 years. You have 1,000 years that took place between the time of creation and the time of Noah. You have another 1,000 years that took place between the time of Noah and the time of Abraham. You have another 1,000 years that took place between the time of Abraham and the time of David. You have another 1,000 years that took place between the time of David and then the time that Jesus was on the scene. And then you have a period of time of 2,000 years from the time of Jesus to where we are at today, which is why it seems to make sense that we are close to the end times events. Now, what happens today, or what happens in this period of time? Well, you have the final end of the age events. You have the final 7 years of tribulation, the 7 years of what Daniel talks about. It's called the final week in the book of Daniel, but that's today. Now, when the end of the tribulation happens, Revelation 19, when the marriage supper of the Lamb happens, the church is removed, we have been joined with God, the world is God's wrath is poured out on the world. There are just consequences that happen. Then Here is where Jesus, this moment of time, is where Jesus becomes the reigning king, and it happens for 1,000 years. There's going to be peace, there's going to be rest for that 1,000 years, and then at the end of that 1,000 years, we will see the events in Revelation 20 of some judgment towards Satan that will take place, some final great white throne judgment events, and then you have the brand new stuff that is happening, and we are going to see that brand new stuff really start to unfold in Revelation 21. There's going to be a new heaven, a new earth, a new Jerusalem that is going to happen, and it's going to be an incredible event that we are going to see. And then that will happen in chapter 21, and then we will be concluding everything in chapter 22. So 21 and 22, and then the conclusion in 22 as well. So this is the events. This is the timeline, which makes me think that we are close to the end times events. We are within, maybe it's a matter of just years of the end times events, because that corresponds to the 7,000 years, the timeline that we can look at here on the screen that I just drew up. Well, let's get into Revelation 20. So Revelation 19, we had the marriage supper of the Lamb. We had the earth's final battle. Now Jesus is going to take the rule. He is going to take the reign. He will become king from this point on for those 1,000 years. He will rule physically on earth. This is earthly things that are happening, all of these events. So in Revelation 19, not necessarily that every person will die during all of those events. The wrath of God will be poured out, the final battle of the age, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every person is going to die during that time, because there's going to be a remaining group that is going to bow down and worship. All of the nations are going to come and worship Jesus, who will be sitting on the throne. Israel will become the center of the world. It will become the reigning point of the world. So let's look at it together, and let's dive right into chapter 20, and let's start with verses 1 through 3. Here's what it says. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the abyss and a great chain. Now the angel that will subdue Satan is anonymous. It's not Michael, it's not Gabriel, it's not any other high-ranking angel, and it's also not Jesus himself. He's not doing this. There is an angel that is anonymous, that is coming down, and he has a great chain. So notice this. He has the key to the abyss. What is the abyss? Well, this is what Satan is going to be thrown into, and there is a great chain that God has made that is there, that is able to hold Satan in captivity. So this is the events that is going to happen at the end of the tribulation, before the 1,000-year reign. So these events are happening. We've got the tribulation ending. So the tribulation ends here, and then we have, at this ending event, this is where Satan is going to be bound, thrown into the abyss by an anonymous angel who has the key to the abyss, and he's got a great chain. He's going to chain him up, and he will remain chained for these 1,000 years. Okay, so here's what happened. This angel seized the dragon. Now, who is the dragon? That is Satan himself, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. Those are the synonymous words used for Satan: the devil, the dragon, the ancient serpent. So he is the deceiver. He is the one who is ancient. He has created havoc in this world. And this angel has this great chain, and he seizes Satan. And he bound him for 1,000 years. So this is where that 1,000-year mark comes up. Satan is bound for 1,000 years. Isaiah 24, verse 22, it says this: they will be gathered together like prisoners in the pit, and will be shut up in the prison, and after many days be punished. So Isaiah is referencing this in the Old Testament of the event that is going to happen at the end of the age. Again, this is a prophecy of things that will be coming, and a prophecy that's been given thousands of years ago of what events will happen, and it matches up what John says in the book of Revelation. He's going to be bound for 1,000 years. Isaiah says he's going to be thrown in the pit, and he will be after many days be punished. Well, what's the many days? The many days is this 1,000 years. After these 1,000 years, he'll be punished. Now, this angel also threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short while. So he laid hold of him, he bound him, he shut him up, and he put a seal on him. So Satan, interestingly, Satan tried to imprison Jesus in the tomb, but he couldn't. Here, God has no problem restraining Satan himself. So what Satan tried to do, he could not do, but when God restrains Satan and throws him into a pit, it's no problem for him. It doesn't even take God to do this. It takes just one of his angels to do this. So Satan is going to be incarcerated. It's going to restrain him, and then his punishment will actually come. Now, what happens when he is restrained? He will no longer, so he would not deceive the nations any longer. So now you can see what Satan is really after in this world. What he's been after in this world is to deceive the nations. That's what his whole goal has been. That's what he's accomplished over his time. Over the past 6,000 years, he has deceived the nations. He has deceived the individual hearts of people. He's deceived families, but he has deceived the nations. Everything that God has established, every order that God has established when it comes to creation, when it comes to gender, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to truth, when it comes to morality and ethics, everything that God has established, Satan has set up a counterfeit in order to deceive the nations and pull people away from God. Everything God said was good, Satan questioned, or Satan denied, or Satan caused people to turn from that and turn to a different way and a different path. So this has been his ultimate goal. He has been there to deceive the nations, but during this time, during these 1,000 years, he can no longer deceive the nations. So the world will be operating without any deception of Satan going on. It will be a sense of peace that will be happening. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says this, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. At this moment, he can no longer do so. At this moment, he is no longer deceiving, and no longer is he walking around like a roaring lion seeking to devour. Now he is locked up and he is sealed from this time on, and he will be sealed for 1,000 years. Now, this period of time, again, what I've mentioned before, is known as the Millennium. Throughout church history, there's been a lot of discussion and debate over what the Millennium actually is. Now, the Millennium talks of the reign of Jesus for that 1,000 years, but out of this, out of some really poor theological interpretation, we have come with the ideas of an amillennialism or amillennialism. We have also come up with the doctrine of post-millennialism, which really says that Jesus will return to the earth before the millennial, and he will, or he's already done so, or it's somehow different than what God has actually said would actually happen. And so the millennial will happen. This idea of postmillennialism is that the idea that the millennial age will happen before Jesus' return. So you'll have 1,000 years of Satan no longer deceiving the nations before Jesus actually returns, which is actually incorrect when you read it according to Scripture. Well, Satan is going to be bound. We know that. We know that he will no longer deceive the nations, and we know that Jesus will be the one reigning during this time. Satan has been locked and he has been sealed, and there has been and he has been thrown into the abyss. Well, let's keep going. Verse 4. All right, so before we move on, let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen in these 1,000 years. This idea of the 1,000 years of the reign of Christ is going to be very important for us to understand what's going to happen. So we have the tribulation ending. So the tribulation ends here. We have Jesus setting up his rule and his reign, and Jesus is going to rule and reign for 1,000 years. What is that going to look like, and what's going to happen during that time? Well, we know several things about the millennial because of what the Bible tells us. So let me cover just a few of these things. During the millennium, what is going to happen? Well, number one, we're going to see this, that Israel will be the superpower of the world. That's going to happen during this time. Israel will be the superpower of the world. Now, how do we know this to be the case? Well, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, Ezekiel 17, 22 through 24 indicates this. All the nations shall flow to the capital of Jesus's government, which will happen there in Israel on the Temple Mount in Israel. So that is going to happen. Israel will now be the superpower of the world during the 1,000-year reign. During this time, people will, citizens of the world will submit to Jesus. They will submit to Jesus and acknowledge Jesus as Lord of the world. They will acknowledge his lordship and they will submit to them as the Lord of the world. That will happen during the 1,000 years. That's according to Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. During this time, there will be peace. There will be no more war. So you'll have 1,000 years where there will be no more war, there will be peace on the world. That if there is conflicts between nations or conflicts between people during this time, it will be brought before Jesus or one of Jesus's representatives, and they will handle it. They will deal with this. That you can look at. You can look at again Isaiah 2, 1 through 5. That's a very important verse when it comes to this. So Israel is the superpower. Jesus is the king of the world. He's the king, the ruler of the world. Everybody acknowledges that, and everybody submits to his lordship. During that time, there will be peace and no more war. We also know that during that time, very interestingly, that humans and animals will go back to a state where they relate like they did in Genesis chapter 9. What happened in Genesis chapter 9? You've ever wondered about Noah getting all of the animals onto the ark? How did all of that happen? Well, if you look at Genesis chapter 9, you look at Isaiah 11. So I'm going to write that one up there too, Isaiah 11. That it's going to refer to and reference the fact that animals and humans will be able to get along. There was no more predatory kinds of things. In fact, let me read to you Isaiah 11, verses 6 through 9. It says, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. The young one shall lie down together. The lion shall eat like the ox. The nursing child shall play by the cobra's hole. And the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." So the relationship between humans and animals will change. It will go back to the time, like the time of Noah, when they were able to relate together without that kind of fear. Predators and prey were able to relate together. You had humans and prey, or humans and predators being able to relate together. So that's an incredible thing that will happen during that 1,000 years, according to Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 through 9. What else do we have that's going to happen in the millennial? We have the fact that it references that King David will have a prominent place during the millennial earth ruling over Israel. Now that's a reference to Jesus. So it is Jesus again ruling over the earth. We know that during the millennial there will be blessing and security for Israel, who will be the superpower of the world. Blessing and security for Israel, because that's what it tells us in Amos chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. During the millennial, it will be a time of purity and devotion to God. So there will be a time of purity and devotion to God, according to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 13. During the time of the millennial, there will be temple activities that will be going on in Israel, and the purpose of the temple activities will be a memorial to God's work in the past, the way how God has always been faithful. And during the time of the millennial reign, there will be saints that will experience resurrection. Now, this is not everybody. This is some that will experience resurrection, who will also help. Who will help in the leadership of the world. They will have different roles and responsibilities, and they will help in the leadership of the world. That's according to Luke chapter 19, Revelation 20, which we're going to read next, Revelation 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. So there's going to be a role that some of the saints are going to play. Now, this is not everybody, but this is going to be some of the saints will be resurrected during that 1,000 years. The rest will remain with God in heaven. We're going to look at that on this verse and the next slide as well. So let's look at that. So that's what's going to happen during the millennial. Let's read about this. So John says, "Then I saw thrones." Now, John had just seen Satan thrown into a pit. He was locked into a pit, sealed into a pit. He was bound up by chains. And during the 1,000 years, then John says, "I saw thrones and people sat upon them." Now, who's on the thrones? Well, this is the council of God. This is the 24 elders. We know at least that part of the elders probably are the 12 disciples. Judas not being one of them, but Paul taking his place most likely, because Paul really was one of the disciples as well. There were thrones, people sat upon them. There was the council of God, those to whom authority to judge was given. Now, I've put references up on the screen, and you can look up those references. I'm not going to look at all of that right now. I will highlight just a few of those verses for you, however. But there was authority, there was this throne. Daniel 7:9 says, "While I was watching, the thrones were set up." The thrones, plural. The thrones were for the Ancient of Days, that's the Father God, and it was for the 24 elders, the council of God, as it were. Daniel 7:22, it says that judgment came in favor of the Kedoshim, that's the holy ones of God, and that there was a time, it says in Daniel 7, that the Kedoshim possessed the kingdom. So this is what's happening during that 1,000 years. Matthew 19:28. Jesus said to them, "Amen, I tell you, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne in the new world, you who have followed me shall also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So we know that that's most likely at least going to include this group of 24 elders, most likely will include the 12 disciples. Now, the other 12, we don't know. And this council of God, the elders of God, we don't really know. Okay. So then John says, "And I saw the souls of those," and this is down here, okay? This is the saints, the resurrected ones who have a role and responsibility. "I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony." Now, when were they beheaded? They were beheaded in the end times events. Why were they beheaded? Because of their testimony for Jesus, Yeshua, and because of the Word of God. So these are saints in the end times that are beheaded because they followed Jesus and they would not back down and they would not turn away, and they are being rewarded with a responsibility and a role now in Jesus' new millennial kingdom. Now, these saints had not worshipped the beast. They had not worshipped his image. They had not received the mark on their forehead or on their right hand. That's why they were killed. But don't worry, they came to life. They came back to life. Look at Isaiah 25 and 26, Daniel 12, Malachi 3. These that were beheaded, who have come back to life, they are the ones that then reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years. Okay. Now, does this mean that everybody is part of this 1,000-year reign? The answer to that is no, because of what it says on the very next verse. Let's look at verse 5, and we'll learn why not everybody's going to be resurrected during that time. There will be the majority of people that will remain in heaven during this 1,000 years. But a day is as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a day. It's going to go by pretty quick. There will be plenty of things to enjoy and wonderful parts of what it means to be in heaven. The 1,000-year reign is reserved for those who are coming back to life, who are the ones who have been martyred during the end times events. They're the ones that come back and reign with the Messiah for the 1,000 years. Not everybody will. Why? Well, let's look at what it says in the next verse. "The rest of the dead did not come to life, until the 1,000 years were completed. So we have multiple resurrections. So we have, first of all, look at the timeline. So let's go back to 2,000 years ago. We have Jesus. He was number one. He was the first fruits. He was the number one resurrection. Then we have 2,000 years of time goes by since Jesus, and then we have the final 7 years of tribulation. So the 7-year tribulation. This is the time where a lot of people are going to be martyred. This is going to be a tremendous amount of martyrs during that time. Then you have, kicking off the 1,000 years, you have Jesus, that Satan being locked up, thrown away. Jesus is now king. He's now ruling. He's now the ruler of the world. Now you're going to have resurrection number 2. Resurrection number 2 is going to consist of those who were killed in the Great Tribulation. This is going to be those who've been martyred. Okay, but the rest of us, maybe we're us, I don't know. We could be a part of the martyrs group. We don't know that yet. But the ones who are not part of that, they will have part in resurrection number 3. This is going to be others, everyone else, all others. Okay? See, and why do we say that? Because that's what it says. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. So what does that mean for everyone else? Well, there's a significant group that are remaining in heaven, probably the majority of people, absolutely the majority of people, probably the extremely high percentage. They remain in heaven. The ones that are part of this number 2 resurrection are only the ones that we just read on the previous, the ones that were beheaded because of their faith, their testimony in the Word of God. They did not back down. Now, who kills by beheading today in the world today? Well, that is the Muslim groups that will behead because you will not reject Jesus, you do not accept Allah, and they are beheading. We've seen examples of this. It's happening now. It's happening in the Middle East. It's happening in Africa. We have numerous events where people are being beheaded because of their faith in Christ. That's the number 2 resurrection. That's what was on the previous verse, verse 4. The rest did not come to life. So this is the first resurrection. Well, he says the first resurrection. I have it listed number 2 because Jesus is the first resurrection. But what John means, this is the first resurrection after these events. He's not counting the resurrection of Jesus. He's counting the resurrection of the end times events. So this is the first resurrection here. Okay, that's what John is just referring to right there. This is the first resurrection. Now he says, notice this, and let me just highlight this for us. He says this: how fortunate and holy is the one who has a share in the first resurrection. Okay, this is an amazing thing. The one who actually is able to be a part of that 1,000 years of Jesus's reign. That's a pretty cool opportunity, but it's an opportunity that is reserved for those who have given of their life. So it's not for everybody. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the end of that 1,000 years. Now, over such, the second death has no authority. What is the second death? Well, the second death is the ultimate death that is going to happen, where final judgment is going to happen, the white throne judgment, where you're going to die once physically, then you're going to face the judgment. So we die physically, then we face, so we die physically, then we are going to face the white throne judgment. Those who have believed in Jesus don't have to worry about that because you are already part of the marriage supper of the Lamb. The white throne judgment is where all will be brought before the throne of God, and then they will go into what's called the second death. The first death is dying physically. The second death is forever separated from Jesus himself. You're forever separated, and it's a scary thing to go into that. Over such, the second death has no authority, but they who's they? This is this group, the martyrs. They shall be Kohanim. What is a Kohanim? We have talked about the Kedoshim. The Kedoshim is the holy ones. The Kohanim is what was the priests in God's system. The priests. Who were the priests in the Old Testament? They were the Kohanim. They were the part of the priestly line. The line of Aaron was the high priest. The Levites were the Kohanim, and they served God. The ones who are the resurrected martyrs will be a special group. They will be the Kohanim of God and of the Messiah. These are the ones that they shall reign with him for 1,000 years. So these are the ones that during this time, they are reigning with him. So not everybody is resurrected during this time. The rest remain in heaven. Then the rest that will remain in heaven will be resurrected as we get into chapter 21, and we see the new world, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, all of those events that are going to happen. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you're following along with the events that are going to happen. Well, let's look at what happens after the end of the 1,000 years, starting in verse 7. Verse 7, when the 1,000 years had ended, Satan shall be released from his prison, and he shall come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth. So we have the time, the 1,000 years, and at the beginning of the 1,000 years, Satan is bound, but at the end of the 1,000 years, he is going to be released. And so it's kind of a troubling thing that he comes out, and what does he do when he is released? He again deceives the nations. So when he deceives the nations, he is going to have the ability to go out in the world and actually deceive the world again for a final time. There will be some who in this time that will accept his deception. They will accept it. And it says that Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. So what is that? Gog and Magog is always a reference to the specific regions that we have talked about before of the Middle East that will be deceived at that time. So there will be groups that will still be deceived. It's been a wonderful 1,000 years. It's been, Jesus has been reigning for that 1,000 years. Why would people choose to rebel? Well, it's a final demonstration of mankind's rebellion and depravity. Just because people outwardly are conforming to Jesus during those 1,000 years doesn't mean that in their hearts they are really worshiping him and recognizing the lordship of Jesus. So there will be people who will be deceived still at that time. They will be gathered together. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So it's a lot of people that are going to gather together at that end of that 1,000 years who may be conforming to Jesus, but they have not been transformed by Jesus in their hearts. They will come together against God with Satan, deceiving all of them. Their number is huge. It's like the sand of the sea. They will camp, and they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the Kedoshim and the beloved city. But God finally dealt with them. Fire fell from heaven and consumed them. So in this end times, though Jesus has been reigning for the 1,000 years, though the world has been at peace for 1,000 years, there will be people who have not truly bowed their hearts down to Jesus. They have conformed, but they have not been transformed. And then you have Jerusalem being surrounded by a massive group that has rejected Jesus, who's being deceived by Satan when he is released. And when Satan is released, there at the end, and he deceives the people, God will ultimately destroy them with from fire from the heavens, and it will consume them. Now the final conclusion of Satan happens now. We have reached verse 10. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are too, and they shall be tortured day and night forever and ever. So there is a forever and ever that is happening. So who is being thrown in? The beast. Who's the beast? The Antichrist. Who is the false prophet? That is the number 2. That is the second in command to the Antichrist. Who is he thrown in there with? Satan himself. The devil, the Antichrist, and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. They are going to be tortured day and night. So they do not cease to exist. God has not just wiped them out so that they no longer exist. They will be tortured day and night forever and ever. This is an amazing thing. So this is at the end of the 1,000 years. So we have the 1,000 years where Satan is bound. Satan is bound at the beginning of the 1,000 years. During the 1,000 years, Jesus reigns. He is the king in Israel during that 1,000-year reign. Then we have Satan released. And Satan, when he is released, he goes about and he deceives, taking as many down with him as he possibly can during that time of deception. This great group then comes and surrounds Jerusalem. When they surround Jerusalem, when they surround Israel, when they surround the place, then God finally destroys them. He destroys them with fire from heaven. When that happens, Satan is ultimately going to be punished, and so now he's been released, but now he is going to be thrown into the lake of fire. And in that lake of fire with the Antichrist, with the false prophet, they will be tortured day and night forever and ever. Now, after this event happens, we have another final event for mankind before all of the new stuff takes place, and this is called the Great White Throne. What is the Great White Throne? The Great White Throne is the final judgment of God toward all of humanity. So what happens? The Great White Throne and the one seated on it. So this is God seated on the Great White Throne. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, but no place was found for them. So it was a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It was a fearful thing to know that his presence is here and his judgment is coming. The Great White Throne is a judgment time of humanity, and there was no place that people could escape from the throne. John says, I saw the dead, all the dead. The books were opened. Another book was opened, the book of life. Now, all of this, he saw the dead, the great and the small. They were all standing before the throne of God. So this is all of humanity now is here standing before the throne of God. What are you standing for? Because you're going to face judgment. Now, there were a couple of books that were open. The books that were opened, and then there was another book that was open. One book was going to bring judgment. The other book was the book of life. Now, this is a good news book, the book of life. The dead were judged. They are all going to be judged according to what was written in the books, according to their deeds. So the books, the people were going to be judged according to the books. What is in the books? A couple of kinds of books. There's one that's going to be judgment. It's going to be deeds. There's another book that is going to be the book of life. And that's how people are going to be judged by the end. Either your name is written in the book of life or it's not. If your name is written in the book of life, there is good news. If it's not written in the book of life, then it is bad news. And you're going to see exactly what happens here in verse 13. And this will be the final verses of chapter 20. We've got verses 13 through 15. And look at what happens at this judgment time before the great white throne judgment of God. So the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Sheol, which is another reference to hell, gave up the dead in them, and they were each judged. So this is the final judgment of humanity. They were each judged, each one of them according to their deeds. So God will bring judgment. So we've got the throne of God, and God sitting on the throne, and he will stand in judgment or sit in judgment against all people. And people will be judged according to their deeds. This is the second death. So what was the first death? Well, the first death is when you die physically. This is physical death. The second death is when the ultimate spiritual pronouncement takes place upon all of the dead of the world. The sea will give up the dead. The hell will give up its dead. The world has people that would still be living at the time. They will be all judged at that time. And the second death is the ultimate lake of fire death. The lake of fire death, the second death, is the scary thing that people are going to fall into. Now, now notice this, if anyone was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So John is seeing this. John is seeing the judgment happen. And essentially the judgment is this: either your name is in the book of life, or your name is not in the book of life. And that's the only two options. If your name is in the book of life, then you have hope. You have God. You're alive. If you're not, then you are thrown into the second death, the lake of fire. Now, the lake of fire is a real situation that God says that you will be thrown into. How long did it say that Satan and the Antichrist and the prophet were thrown in, and how long were they going to be tortured? It said forever and ever. So the lake of fire, which is the same place that everyone else is thrown into, there is a continual forever part to this story. It is not that people just cease to exist and they are just wiped away and there's no memory of them and they have no memory or they're just gone. That's not what it is. They are thrown into the lake of fire, and it is a forever kind of punishment. And this is why it is so important that you know the Lord, that you have committed your heart to the Lord, and that you are walking with him, that you've trusted in him. And when you have trusted in Jesus as Savior, you have been redeemed. God, in his loving kindness, looks down upon humanity, a hopeless humanity, a humanity that is dead, a humanity that is walking according to the course of this world, according to the plan of Satan, a humanity that has been deceived. He's looking at sinful humanity, and in his great mercy, he looks at sinful humanity and he offers sinful humanity grace. Grace is the kindness and the mercy of God given, the love of God given toward humanity. And what we do is we either reject it or we receive it. We receive it by faith. We receive it by trusting in him, by putting our faith in him. When we receive it by faith, then we are in turn saved, and our names are written in the book of life. And when your name is in the book of life, you don't have to worry about the lake of fire. You don't have to worry about the second death, because your name is in the book of life, and you have hope and eternity with God forever. Well, these are the events that are going to happen, and all of these events happen in the final 1,000 years. So just to recap, what happens in those 1,000 years? No, number one, Satan is bound, he is chained, he is thrown into the abyss, a stone is placed over it, he is sealed up. He cannot, for those 1,000 years, deceive the nations any longer. He is the great deceiver. He has deceived and he continues to deceive, but at that moment he can no longer deceive. Now, from that time on, for 1,000 years, Jesus reigns upon the world. Israel becomes the superpower of the world. Israel is the center of the world. It is peace for 1,000 years, and it all comes through Jesus. He is the one in control. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be released, and he will deceive again and turn people away from God again. People's hearts, though they may be following Jesus because he's the ruler of this world, their hearts may not be his. They may be conformed to God, but they haven't been transformed by him. And the ones that have not been transformed, that are easily deceived, will follow Satan into that final event that happens as they surround Israel again, and God destroys them with fire from heaven. Then the great white throne judgment happens, and all are judged at that that great white throne judgment. All are going to be in fear and trembling as they come before God, but all will be judged. Either your name is in the book of life or it's not. If it's in the book of life, you have hope and eternal security with him, because you will be with him forever. If your name is not in the book of life, then there's reason to be in dread and fear, because the ultimate conclusion is there's a second death coming, and that is the lake of fire. We die once physically, and then we go on to judgment. Either we die physically and have our names written in the book of life, and when we go to judgment, there's security and we go on to be with God forever, or our names are not in the book of life, and you die once physically, and then you are thrown into the lake of fire, which is the second death. That is a scary thought. It is a terrifying thought, is a painful thought, especially for loved ones that you know. So make sure that you do everything in your power to share the love of Christ everywhere you go, especially with your family members, to make sure that they escape what is to come, escape the end times events, the wrath of God, the lake of fire events that are going to happen, and that they are with God forever in eternity. Well, next week we'll get into chapter 21, and the week after we will conclude a Revelation study with chapter 22. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you back here in another week as we get into chapter 21. See you then. Have a great time.